We are so grateful to be here with you today.
Thank you. I'm honored to be here with you. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us into your home. You are an internationally acclaimed spiritual teacher, author of 11 books, and lecturer. When I was preparing to sit down with you, I thought it was such a daunting task. How do you prepare to interview Marianne Williamson?
I don't know. It's just I've been around a while, so there's a lot of accumulated experience.
11 books. Now 11 New York Times best-selling books.
No, 6 New York Times bestsellers.
Okay, but you had 4 number 1
Thank you.
bestsellers, which is quite an accomplishment. And when I was preparing, I thought, where do I start with this incredible volume of work, this life work of yours? And I was drawn to A Return to Love. And I had never, I'll admit, I'd never read it before. And it's just like one big soundbite after the next. Like I could just quote everything in this book. It's just so precious.
Thank you.
And I had no idea that it was published in 1992, 24 years ago. And as I was reading this book, I felt this is more relevant today, possibly, than it was when you first published it.
I don't think it's more relevant today, but it was more revolutionary then because these conversations weren't happening yet.
But I think we still need it. I think it's
when you're talking about metaphysical information, it's eternal. It was needed 1,000 years ago. It will be needed 1,000 years from now.
Right.
Unless 1,000 years from now we will all have so self-actualized that it will be already infused into the core of humanity's consciousness. So it's like physical exercise. You never get to stop.
Right.
So you don't just learn metaphysical information. You learn to apply it, to practice it, and then you never get to stop. You do that to hone your attitudinal muscles every day, the way you hone your physical muscles through exercise, yoga, and so forth.
Let's just go back for a second, because I want to make sure that everybody understands the full scope of your career. How does a young girl who grew up in Texas, who I read somewhere one time ran a metaphysical bookstore.
It was a small general stock bookstore, actually, the Heights bookstore.
And you went on to become this fierce goddess spiritual teacher who actually put a hat into the political ring.
Yeah, thank you. And I started reading A Course in Miracles. The Course in Miracles talks about how the teacher is half a step ahead in time. I haven't done, my path has not been that different than many, many people. It's just that I started earlier than a lot of people that I know. I started reading A Course in Miracles in the 1970s. And then by 1983, I started lecturing at the Philosophical Research Society here in Los Angeles on the books in 1983.
I want to make sure that everybody knows what A Course in Miracles is.
A Course in Miracles is a set of books. It has been referred to as a self-study program of spiritual psychotherapy. It is not a religion. There is no doctrine. There is no dogma. It is a psychological mind training based on universal spiritual themes. And the goal of the course is the attainment of inner peace. So the training is in relinquishing a thought system based on fear that dominates the planet, and the acceptance instead of a thought system based on love, which means aligning ourselves with the truth of who we are. And Freud defined neurosis as separation from self. And that's how we live on this planet. So many people feel like they're alien here. Well, if you feel like you're an alien here, which all of us do on some level, it's because we are. The consciousness that dominates this planet is not true to who we are. And so our seeking to find meaning, much less happiness, only within the confines of the worldview and the structure that now prevails within our experience is fruitless. It's impossible. It's hopeless. Because that's not where love can be found. That's not where hope can be found. That's not where meaning can be found. That's not where peace can be found. It's when we know, I live in this world, but this world, I'm in this world, but not of this world. My body is like a suit of clothes. My physical senses show me one world. And it's not that that world is bad. It's that that world is of itself neutral. My mind is a choice every moment, and you do make this choice either consciously or unconsciously. What purpose you ascribe to your experience here. Now, if I ascribe to my experience on this planet that I be used as a vessel of love, and that our mortal experience be used as an exaltation of that love, then you can find happiness and peace and purpose on this planet. But if we live on this planet with any other purpose in mind, grasping for something that this world can't give you, then life is sorrowful and fearful, and sometimes deeply, deeply destructive.
So how did you find the Course, or did the Course find you?
Well, that's always true of anybody who picks up any book, really.
Right.
I was at a cocktail party in New York City in the 1970s, like the mid-70s, and I saw the Course in Miracles on a coffee table. And I picked it up, and if you look at the introduction to the Course, it says, this is a Course in Miracles. It is required reading. It is a required course. And I thought that, when do you pick up a book and it tells you that it's required? And I looked on the front of the book. I thought the title was intriguing, A Course in Miracles. I looked at the title and there was no author mentioned. So I just found the whole thing intriguing. I started reading further, and I noticed that there is traditional Christian language. That was a little like, but I didn't forget the book. And a year later, it definitely arrived in my life, because my boyfriend at the time, who had been with me at that party, we didn't even discuss it during that year, but we both looked at it. A year later, somebody had told me that the book was being published out of an apartment, the Beresford apartment, on Central Park West. So a year after that party, I'm on the bus going up Central Park West, and I was on my way to a doctor. And I had seen during those months somebody reading it on that same bus, who was, by the way, someone I'd known a year before, and he had always been in arguments with my roommate. None of that is accidental. And something in me said, it's time. I'm going to get that book. And I noticed that apartment. I said, I'm going to get that book. So later that day, I came back to my apartment. I walked in, and A Course in Miracles, which at that time was still published in 3 separate volumes, was sitting on my dining room table. And I looked up at my boyfriend, and he just looked at me and he said, yeah, I thought it was time. He
Wow.
had seen it in a bookstore on, I think, West 72nd Street, and had brought them home. So,
And there you went.
and at that point, the Christian language, I was willing to read further and to see that, yes, it is traditional language, but these words, these terms are used in very non-traditional ways. This is not a religious text. It
Right.
is a
And I think sometimes people confuse that, and I want to get into that with you
Sure.
as well. But I also think that I would be doing our audience a disservice if I didn't bring forth your most famous quote, or what's most...
And that's from, of course, A Return to Love.
which I've also read has been misattributed to Nelson Mandela. So you're both in good company. And I'll just quote just the beginning part of it. But our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us.
Mm-hmm.
It's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Well, I can't take credit for the basic concept, because that book is, as the subtitle says, my reflections on the principles of A Course in Miracles. So what is most exciting about that quote that people relate to is a basic tenet of the Course, which is, you're not afraid of your neuroses. You're afraid of the possibility of greatness.
Right. Well, I also came across a piece that you wrote recently in the Huffington Post, and it really stopped me in my tracks. And I wanted to just, applaud you for it, for so bravely and fiercely tackling these current events with your grace and your love, but also calling out the platitudes and the love and light hashtags, and of how we bring our spirituality into the current events. Like sometimes we talk about, how do we bring our practice from the yoga mat to the world? How do we insert it into our politics, into all aspects of our lives? And I think in this piece, you really blew the lid off of a lot of these topics and a lot of these subjects, our own relationship to our spirituality, to God, to how we bring it to the world.
Those of us who are into spirituality, higher consciousness, we should be the biggest grown-ups in the society. We should not be the disengaged, sometimes ditzy, self-centered, infantilized people over on the sidelines saying, well, I just don't want anything toxic in my life. There's nothing positive about that. There's nothing positive about failing to yell fire if in fact the house is burning down. If you have become knowledgeable, and particularly if you've become a practitioner of the fundamental spiritual principles that run the universe, then you have very, more than sacred knowledge, extremely critical knowledge for the times in which we live. Because if you know what changes one life, you're the one who has a clue as to what would change this world. Because all the world is a reflection of the consciousness of the people who live here. So we are the last people who should be sitting out the great social and economic and political issues of our day. We have a gift that we are withholding if we do not enter into the conversation. There are principles that guide how our lives unfold. And there are the same principles guiding how our collective life unfolds. And there is karma, or cause and effect, for an individual, and there is karma, or cause and effect, for a nation. So for instance, one of the women who died in 9/11 on one of the planes was a woman that I knew, Barry Berenson. Now, if you were to ask me, name 5 of the sweetest people you've ever known, I would put her on that list. She is, if anything, the face of America that you would want everybody to see. But if the karma of a country, if a country is reaping karma, whoever happens to be standing there, now by the way, I'm not saying that 9/11, I'm not saying all that 9/11 was America reaping its karma. I'm not saying that
right.
at all. But what I am saying is that what the drama of a nation will affect the citizens of that nation because we're standing there.
Right.
So I believe that in something like that article, when you look at something like ISIL and terrorism and so forth, one of the beautiful things that happened around after 9/11 was that there was this very powerful moment where everybody was saying for days, why do they hate us? Do you know why they hate us? I didn't know people hated us. Why do they hate us? People honestly didn't know. We had been so misinformed. We had been so uninformed. The truth had been so obfuscated. Our corporatized media had basically had made the whole idea of foreign correspondence such a tiny part of the news. The average American didn't know what had been happening in American foreign policy and so forth. Now, Americans are waking up because the situation has become so critical. So what do you do as an individual? If you understand spiritual principle, one of the first things you have to do when life has gone wrong is to ask yourself, what part did I play here? If somebody comes to me for counseling and says, well, Marianne, 90% of this was the other person's stuff, my response to that is, well, we have 10% of it to talk about. And the Course in Miracles says you pay a very high price for not taking 100% responsibility for your experience. And that is that if you don't take responsibility for it, you can't change it. So the truth of the matter is, if you look at just even at the invasion of Iraq alone, not only the utter immorality of the fact that this country has not attacked us, it had nothing to do with 9/11, the idea that they may or may not have had weapons of mass destruction. Well, if you looked beyond the most superficial layer of George Bush and Colin Powell, you already knew that there was great disagreement about this. Plus, are we going to attack China? Are we going to attack Russia? Are we going to attack India? I mean, this is outrageous. He had killed some of his own people. So have the Chinese. Come on, hello, please. And he was also, just in strategic terms, Saddam Hussein was a secularist. He wanted nothing to do with radical religious elements. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But you cannot overestimate the significance of the stupidity, the horror, the immorality of our invading that country. And it exploded this hornet's nest. Mm-hmm. Now, it has become popular even among those who supported the war to admit, well, that was a mistake. But that is an example of a country that is so not in touch with its soul. To simply say about this, with all the soldiers from America who died, with all the people over there who died, oh, it was a mistake. It was a mistake. You want to go a little deeper with that? Because in spiritual healing, you have to face the horror. You have to go into the depth of understanding what you've done in order to atone at the deepest level.
Okay, so going back to the HuffPo piece where we're talking about this, it's about not just shining light on the darkness to extinguish the darkness, it's about bringing our darkness to the light.
Yes.
You use a term which was really exciting to me, which was purification, and that we as a nation, as individuals, as a nation, as a collective, need to do this process of purification to bring our darkness to the light.
Well, what the Course in Miracles says is, miracles are everyone's right, but purification is necessary first. So anybody who does the Course in Miracles, anybody who is in AA, anybody who studies any kind of serious spiritual information and practice knows, the line in the Bible, God shall not be mocked. The Course says that means he's not, okay? So this idea of this faux spirituality, where we don't really go deep, this is not going to change the molecular structure of the universe, but you are realigning yourself with truth will. And that means purifying yourself of thought that is false. And thought that is false is thought that has deviated from compassion and deviated from righteousness, right-useness, and led to behavior that does the same.
I love that.
Now, there is a principle in Judaism, in Christianity, and the Course in Miracles, and it's a very powerful concept, and that is the idea of the atonement. And the atonement is a kind of cosmic reset button. It is where you go back to the mistake and you own that you did it. In Catholicism, it's confession as you go along. In Judaism, the holiest day of the year is Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. In Alcoholics Anonymous, you have to take a fearless moral inventory. You have to admit the exact nature of your wrongs. That is the purification process. Abraham Lincoln established a national day of prayer.
I love that. I didn't even know that.
Yeah. He said a nation must confess its sins.
Right.
Now, that was his language about confessing the sins. Many of us wouldn't go with that language. But the idea of recognizing you're wrong. And that is bringing that back to America and recognizing, as Abraham Lincoln said that we must do, the unbelievable arrogance. And that is to put it, that is the nicest thing you can say about this trend in American foreign policy since the end of World War II. If you look back at something like America's regime change, this is such an example of a word, it's a euphemism, regime change. That means you go in and you kill the people who don't agree with you, and you make things go down the way you want them to go down, even though you yourself are supposedly a democracy. And you will do that even to democratically elected people. Saddam Hussein was not, but the president of Iran, who we overthrew in 1952, 1953, absolutely was. He didn't go along with British Petroleum. He had the audacity to believe that Iranian oil should belong to the Iranians. Can you imagine? So the United States joined. We overthrew him, put in the Shah of Iran, and what that ultimately led to was the establishment of what we have now, which is this Islamic, this very oppressive Islamic domination. And by Islamic, I don't mean Islam, I mean Islamic, which is that fundamental face of their government and other governments. And now, if you know what karma means, and you know that as the Course in Miracles says, you create what you defend against, if you were applying any kind of principle to any of that, you would know not only that it was wrong, you would know that it would reap consequences. So people who understand how the universe operates need to be shouting like, don't go there. And when the consequences that were inevitable do appear, we should be the ones saying, okay, this is what you do. First of all, we have to admit we've done it. We have to atone for it. The United States is different than other nations. And as individuals, we're very decent people. I love Americans. If I'm traveling internationally, I always love to sit next to an American on airplanes. We're not the most sophisticated people. We have a little bit of a vulgar side, but the world knows we have a spunk. We have a let's go do it. Right. It's what's led me to my career. It's what led you to your career. Right. Let's do this. Yeah. Nobody has that like dream. Americans. That's right. And that's what's so beautiful. But we also collectively, have a capacity for grandiosity and denial that is dangerous.
Shove it under the rug.
Shove it under the rug. And this very corporate don't complain, don't explain.
Right.
And our government has been doing that for many years, unlike someone like a Abraham Lincoln. And it has gotten us into terrible problems. It has Not only has it enabled the American people to look away, the system that does this has counted on the American people looking away. That's why, as I said before, after 9/11, there was a lot of, why do they hate us? Do you know why they hate us? And for a few days on television, there were really intelligent people, scholars, explaining what had happened. A lot of Americans were going, whoa, I had no idea. And you could see the moment when our government went, none of that. That stuff was off TV. Just go shop and we'll handle this.
Right.
Was the message we received.
Well, I was still living in Manhattan. I was there for 9/11 with a baby.
Right. Oh,
and the other thing that took place when that went down was the seeds were planted for a fear-mongering crisis. Because I will tell you, I lost childhood friends. I waited for a phone call to find out if a very close friend of mine, had made it out of the building, and she didn't.
Right.
So there was a lot of tragedy and a lot of pain and a lot of anguish and tremendous fear, really for the first time. And what happened during that was all of a sudden it was like this rise up of anger and retaliation, and people, it was very easy at that moment for people to get on that bandwagon like, we've got to do something about this. We've got to do something about this.
Well, I think in the first few days, it was a very pregnant moment. I think we could have gone another way. It could have been seen as an international police incident. Other countries loved us. First of all, I'm not a pacifist per se. I personally believe that military action in Afghanistan at that time was reasonable, and I supported it then. And I'm not saying that if you look at the world the way we're talking about, military action is by definition off the board. I don't believe that.
Right.
But I do believe it could have been looked at as an international police incident. And I remember a television show that I watched with Dan Rather, and he had a round table. Now, this was about a week or two after the event, and everybody at the table had lost an immediate family member. One woman had lost a husband. Another man had lost his son. Everybody in the round table had lost an immediate family member. At the end of the panel, Dan Rather, who had not lost a family member, said to every person on the panel, "Do you want revenge?" And every single person went, "No, no." I remember one of them saying, "I can't bear the thought that another parent would suffer through what I've suffered through." Another one of them said, "No, what we need is for people to know who we are. If people knew who we were, they wouldn't do this. Because when the heart breaks, the heart is more open. You don't go into anger. Your heart is open, and then it's shut." And I thought it was so interesting because at the end of the panel, Dan Rather said, "Well, I want revenge. I want it to be fierce, and I want it to be swift." And I thought, yeah, easy for you to say, because the people who are suffering the most, that's not where they've gone.
Right.
They don't go to that. And that's what happens when your heart is pierced and it opens, is you're actually in a more loving place. So in those first few days, this
Critical
is where
moments.
leadership matters.
Right.
This is where leadership matters. And so we were led and guided into anger. The fear was there. But the fear, if we had had leaders who held it in a more sophisticated way. You know, an example of this is Franklin Roosevelt during World War II. When you look at the Churchills of the world and Franklin Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower when he was Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces, they were such sober, mature men. They did what needed to be done. There is no doubt about that. But even I think it's interesting that when Franklin Roosevelt would refer to the Nazis, the phrase he used was unworthy men. Look how different even the language is.
Right.
There was no doubt they needed to kick ass militarily, and they did.
Right.
But when you just even hear their languaging, it was like, this needs to be done and we're going to do it. But it came from, it's almost like if you were to look at the chakra system, it came from such maturity and sobriety. Anger, this like low-level adrenaline-based anger, would have actually undercut the excellence that was called for, even in military terms.
Okay, so also to that point, I have a quote from that Huffington Post piece, which again I keep going back to, because I think it was such a powerful
Thank you.
bit of writing. "I do not believe it was immoral to stop Hitler. I believe it would have been immoral not to. But no one, no governmental leader, no general, and no politician really knows what to do about ISIL now. Only God knows. And he will speak into our ears once we have spoken into our hearts, and preferably on our knees to him.
You can liken the Nazis to an operable tumor that could be and was brilliantly surgically removed. ISIL is not like that. ISIL is more like a cancer that has already metastasized. And what we have learned through Iraq, for instance, is that many of these situations, when you do use invasive measures, only spreads the cancer, as it were. Not that ISIL itself existed, but what was there, then this vacuum was created, came in, morphed into ISIL, and so forth. So those, once again, what do those of us on a spiritual path from a sort of new thought paradigm have to offer here? That is the idea of holistic healing, integrative healing. We are very aware, it was our community that really ushered in the conversation of an integrative model where you see issues of body and mind and spirit. So when you seek to only address something like ISIL through military measures, this is analogous to an overemphasis on allopathic healing, where you simply hope that through external remedies of some kind, you can eradicate or suppress the symptoms. That's not going to be enough here. That is not going to be enough here, because it's like playing whack-a-mole. You know, every time they tell us, oh, right. we killed this ISIL leader. Well, I remember Vietnam. You killed one Viet Cong, there's another one behind the tree.
Right.
This is not like there's a certain number of Nazis, so if you kill 15, you have 15 fewer. With this situation, in many cases, you kill 15, and now you've got probably 100 more because there's that guy's brothers and sons and friends who will go avenge his death. So it's just ridiculous for us to be staying focused on just what we need to do rather than face the horror of the real issue, which no one knows exactly what to do. That's why people who are into a larger, more expanded conversation are withholding our gifts, are withholding our peace, are withholding our contribution unless we say, you know, we have an aspect of the healing as well. It's not instead of. This is not complementary, it's not alternative, right. It's integrative. I think everybody, well, that I can just speak for myself. I do think external remedies are part of the modality that's necessary here. However, for us to spiritually apply what we know, which begins, and what I talked about in that article, with a national atonement. Mm-hmm. After World War II, Germany atoned for the Holocaust. I'm not, and I want to be careful here, I'm not liking the mistakes in American foreign policy to the Holocaust. I think a lot of this was ill-intended consequences, and that's just a larger conversation. But I'm not coming from a blame America mentality here. There's a difference between blame and responsibility. Responsibility is to ask yourself, you know, I've said to people in the audiences, where were you during the run-up to the Iraq invasion? Were you even looking? Did you protest? Did you have a no war sign in your front yard? Or did you go la-di-da? And especially, did you use some kind of faux spirituality, say, well, you know, all I can do is be positive and I just don't want negative things in my life? That is not spirituality. That is this counterfeit spirituality, which is very, very convenient for the ego because it's like an excuse for not helping. Another thing for Americans is that we are very good with a to-do list. And that was seen in World War II, and it was seen in a lot of situations. Just tell us what to do, right, and we'll do it. ISIL, it's not that simple. And everybody who's seriously looking at this knows it's not that simple. That's what's so horrifying, and that's what's so scary. And that's what happens when you have to look at something with an integrative approach. It's not just what you do, it's many things. It's lifestyle decisions, it's also spiritual issues, emotional issues, forgiveness. We know it is now statistically substantiated. People who attend spiritual support groups who have been diagnosed with a life-challenging illness live on average twice as long after diagnosis. People who are prayed for in intensive care units get out faster, and so forth. There is a social immune system. And this is really the gift of Mahatma Gandhi, that love not only heals individual relationships, but heals political and social and economic relationships as well. That's not a kumbaya viewpoint. That's not kumbaya. That's very, if anything, it takes even more thinking, right, deeper thinking. And the time of people who are so-called spiritual students not reading up and knowing what's going on the ditzy factor.
We have a
really
great quote here. This was also in the piece. Spiritual seekers should not be infantile, fuzzy-brained, naive observers merely standing on the sidelines with nothing to contribute but loving hashtags while the world community faces an unprecedented crisis. And I loved it.
Is that in that article?
Yeah, it is. This is I'm telling you, this is a whole book.
Well, that's why some people say I'm too tough.
No, but you know what? I think it almost was like when I was reading this, and I've gone back to it several times, I felt like it was the synthesis of a body of your life work.
Yeah.
And you touched on so many things because you are this voice. You are this fierce goddess voice. You are a leader. You can say it. You can tell us, listen, it's about love and it's about God, and we can't separate these aspects of our lives. And until we bring this all together, we can't just put out these platitudes. And
well, those of us who are mothers, those of us who are parents, know that if you love your child, that means you are going to do whatever it takes to protect them. That means you're going to say no to them when love would have you say no to them. Being a lover has fierceness to it. My career, shortly after my career began, the AIDS crisis burst onto the scene in Los Angeles and around the country, around the world. So from the very earliest days of my career, my work was involved with the real deal, real human suffering.
Right.
So when it all became about, do you have the new Lululemon? I could never relate. It's like, what? There's more going on here. So for me, I never saw the separation. And that's why in my book, Healing the Soul of America, I talk so much about Gandhi, I talk so much about Martin Luther King, because this is not about reinventing any wheels. When you look at Gandhi's philosophy, his philosophy of nonviolence, in which he intersects and interfaces spirituality and political activism, this is the force by which he led the movement to get rid of the British colonial empire from India. And then Martin Luther King traveled to India. He brought home those principles and applied them to the struggle for civil rights in the United States in the 1960s. So this isn't about reinventing any wheels.
So I also feel like you have just ripped off a Band-Aid here because there's so many hot button issues. The illusion or the delusion of separateness, the fear, and then also this Pandora's box that we're not to mix church and state. And then the questions.
Separation of church and state is
well, I mean with God.
Okay, but that is where some people get confused. So.
Right.
Separation of church and state is one of the most enlightened aspects of our Constitution. All of us were taught as children how many people came to the United States originally to seek religious freedom. That is sacrosanct. It is so significant. It's so important. What the founders meant by that was that when Congress is meeting, there's no mufti, priest, rabbi, minister, and so forth that can come in and say, you can't pass this law or you have to pass that law. Such as in a nation like Iran, for instance, where the Ayatollah is the final word.
Right.
Okay. And the other half of that is that if I'm having a Course in Miracles meeting or somebody else is in a Catholic church or somebody else is in a synagogue or a mosque or anything like that, a police person can't come in and say, break it up, this is not on the list. Nobody wants to mess with that. But our founders put that in to free and protect and liberate the religious and spiritual conversation, not to diminish it.
Right, not to suppress it.
To protect it, not to suppress it.
Right.
So what we're talking about here is a spiritual conversation. We're not talking about religious institutions or dogma or doctrine. The universal spiritual themes have to do with the laws of consciousness. So the founders, if anything, were protecting our right to go for it.
But this is getting back to that spiritual conversation because, for example, I always say there's this great wall of China that divides the people that are so into the text that they can't see beyond anything, beyond their own nose, and then those who, in the name of higher education or science, deny religion. So there's sort of two, they're like divided factions. Like, how do we bridge the gap so we can have a spiritual conversation where, for example, with A Course in Miracles, sometimes people will they'll hear Christ and they'll think, oh, this is...
Don't concern yourself with what other people are hearing. Don't concern yourself with needing to bridge anything for anybody else. Demonstrate and be the bridge. We don't have to, it's a free country, and that's the beauty of it. We don't all have to think alike. And when it comes to this conversation, we don't need to worry about the people who aren't interested in it. Our job and what you're doing with your work, what I'm doing with mine, is to help harness the energy of those who are interested in the conversation, either are having the conversation or want that conversation and they're getting into it. So don't worry about other people. Worry about articulating to the best of your ability what seems true to you. And if it resonates with others, it resonates with others. And I think clearly what's happening on the planet today, you wouldn't be guided to do your magazine. I wouldn't be guided to do the work I do. And wouldn't experience what we experience around it were it not obvious that this is a resonant field. This is what's happening today. Don't worry about people don't need us to spoon feed them.
Right. Well, I still think, though, it brings this delusion of separateness.
The separation of the different categories?
Seeing ourselves as separate from the other, or that we can't coexist, or that there is perhaps not one universal God or life force or spirituality. We define ourselves. I'm Jewish, I'm Catholic, I'm militant, I'm...
Well, there's in alchemy, there's a beautiful term called separatio. And it's where all the elements are separated out in order to come back together again at a higher level. So it is beautiful that some people are Jewish. It is beautiful that some people are Catholic. It is beautiful that some people are Muslim. It is beautiful that some people are Protestant. It is beautiful that some people are Buddhist. It is beautiful that some people are agnostic. It is beautiful that some people are atheistic. And especially in America, we are a religiously pluralistic nation. So the beauty of America is not that we need to diminish all that. It's that we need to celebrate all that. So that in celebration of who I am, and as long as I feel that you honor who I am, then I'm more likely to be able to join with you at a higher level and see the universality and commonality.
Right. That's the conversation.
Yeah, it's like race. I heard somebody say, we want to be a colorblind society. No, we don't.
Right.
The colorblindness is a handicap. What we want to be is a society in which we celebrate and see the beauty in all the colors.
There's a great quote about God from the Return to Love. Some people think that if we surrender to God, we're giving up personal responsibility. But the opposite is true. We're taking the ultimate responsibility for a situation by being responsible for our thoughts about it.
Once you realize that God is inside you, surrendering to God is surrendering to that which is highest in your own mind. He is in your mind just as you are in his. I always say what is put on the altar is then altered.
Right.
Because when you put a situation in the hands of God, that's the same thing as saying, I put my thoughts about this situation in the hands of God. I am willing for a force in me but not of me, an internal teacher, a thought adjuster, a bridge of perception to reorder my thinking here. Because when my thinking is reordered, I am changed on the level of cause. And then and only then will the effects be
So I'm
altered.
gonna ask you to go back to that. So guide us through your process. Fear enters into your realm. Anger enters into your realm. How do you pull yourself out of it?
I am really a neurotic mess today. I really need help here. And if I meditated in the morning, my chance of ever moving into that place is vastly diminished.
Right. How long do you meditate?
Well, I do the Course in Miracles workbook every day, and most every day I do transcendental meditation, which is 20 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the evening. And in those situations where I've got too much to do or whatever, and I get out of it, and you've got so much going on, that's when you get off. That's when you do get lost in your craziness. So if you have meditated that morning, your chances of even getting close to the cliff are drastically reduced. But that doesn't mean you're going to be a perfect enlightened master. So you say, dear God, I am angry, but I'm willing not to be. I'm really scared, but I'm willing not to be. I am filled with anxiety, but I'm willing not to be. And so please send your spirit into me, into my thinking, and I place this in your hands. And this is a practice that the Course in Miracles calls the holy instant. But it's an attitudinal muscle. It's not just an intellectual shift. We meditate to cultivate the capacity to be still within, just like you do physical exercise to cultivate the capacity to move. Physical exercise so you can move, spiritual exercise so you can be still. And then in your stillness, you're not a nutcase. And we're all at the effect of this barrage of modernity today. From the computer, from the news, from everything going on. We're all just the emails, whatever, you're just constant. So it's just an ADD culture.
Right.
And if you don't, and we're all like caught up in it. And that's why meditation is so important and the cultivation of inner peace is so important. Because then you go out into the world, but you yourself help to transform it.
I just heard a great quote the other day, which is that anything that takes us out of the present moment is an addiction.
Well, anything that takes us out of it is definitely fear-based thinking, and the ego is an addiction to fear-based thinking.
Right. I mean, we think of addiction, we think of alcohol, we think of drugs, but we forget.
Yeah, that's just one
that's
form
our phone,
of
that's
ego.
electronics, that's anything that takes us out of...
Yeah, it's luring into fear-based thought, which is what addiction is.
Right.
For me, it's more, the addiction is an ego-based pattern than it is the ego is an addictive pattern. It's all words, whatever. Same
So
thing.
talk to us about the ego. Is ego edging God out, or is there a need for our ego?
Well, this gets into semantics. I had a therapist once who talked about negative ego and positive ego. The way the Course in Miracles uses it, and this is just, different books, different teachings have different jargon. The way the Course is using it is the way the ancient Greeks used it. It is the idea of a small separated self. It is the false belief that I am separate from you, which is the central delusion. And as long as I believe that I'm separate from you, then I will be insane in my perception of you and insane in my perception of who I am in relationship to you. And that delusion is held in place by the physical senses. Because in this three-dimensional reality, I am separate from you, you're over there and I'm over here. On the level of the quantum field of ultimate reality, there is no place where I stop and you start. The body is just a suit of clothes. So with my physical eye, I see us as separate. But with my third eye, vision of the Holy Spirit, whatever word you want to use, I know that there's no place where I stop and you start. So what I do to you, I'm actually doing to myself.
Right.
And it might take a little time for me to see that, but time is just the learning. And then you begin to really understand that that also means what I do to someone in Iraq, I'm doing to myself, and so forth.
What I withhold from myself, or what I withhold from you, I withhold from myself.
So the training of enlightenment is not a learning process. It is an unlearning process. We are unlearning the thought system that the ego mind keeps in place. The ego, though, is nothing. It is the absence of something. Darkness isn't a thing. It's the absence of light. You turn on the light, the darkness is gone. Fear, which is the mind of ego, because when you deviate from love, love is to fear what light is to dark. Dark is simply the absence of light, and fear is merely the absence of love. So when I cultivate through prayer, through meditation, may my mind be used for purposes of love today, then to that extent, my mind is filled with light, darkness cannot enter. If I am in any situation with any purpose other than to love, I am vulnerable to neurotic thoughts, anxious thoughts, fearful thoughts, angry thoughts, crazy thoughts. To the extent, and that's why you have to train yourself. So the ego mind is the mind when it is turned away from love, which is the same thing as saying when you are separate from yourself. Freud defined neurosis as separation from self. Mm-hmm. And all mind, the Course in Miracles says you can misuse your mental power, but you cannot diminish it. So that means every thought, the Course says, creates form on some level. When I'm extending love, things happen. When I'm projecting fear, things happen too. Now, then you go into the theology, which is yes, but when it's not love, it's actually a mortal hallucination because only love is real. But within this three-dimensional realm, things happen. And the cause of all negative manifestation is fear.
And going back to that notion of separateness and fear. So I'm really an annoying person in your life.
Okay.
And you have to see yourself in me. And
No. We don't go into the Course. I know that that's a real word that people use. You have to see yourself in me. That's not the Course. That's not the technique of the Course. The technique of the Course would be, went through this just the other night. Wow, that woman annoys me. Whoa,
it wasn't me.
Obnoxious. It wasn't you. Trust me. Dear God, thank you for showing me tonight this gap between myself and my enlightened self, because this woman drives me nuts. And it was funny for me because I had just finished a lecture. I was feeling really high. I was sitting with some people that I really loved. One of those things where all's cool, all's love. And then this woman sits down, and I'm confronted with, boy, am I not my Christ itself yet? Because this woman, what you do, the Course in Miracles says you were not asked to have no ego thoughts. You were asked to not have any that you would keep.
Right.
So in the Course you say, I get that I'm not seeing her clearly, because all that's not love is a call for love. She doesn't know how to express herself lovingly and get her needs met. And so there's this fractal of her personality. But if I just recognize her on the level of that fractal, I am in my ego. When people point out your ego, I have to be in my ego to point out somebody's ego. So my judgment of her is by definition my ego. So the technique of the Course is, dear God, I am willing to see this differently. I am willing to see this differently. Now,
help me see it differently.
I am willing to see this. One time I had a situation that I've written about of a woman whose mannerisms seemed very affected to me. She talked in a way that I thought was very affected, and I just, it was like every time she opened her mouth, it was like fingernails on a chalkboard for me. And I prayed. That's the way of the Course. You surrender this. I'm willing to see this differently. You can't make the shift intellectually. You ask for help from that Holy Spirit, thought adjuster, whatever you see that. Within about 2 to 5 minutes, I heard someone who was her friend say to that woman, is it true that they're letting your father out of prison? So in this interaction, and I was just an observer, I was just listening, I heard this one woman say to her, is it true that they're letting your father out of prison? Now they're just talking because they're friends. And what I then heard was that she, and I think a sibling, had been among those severely abused children, literally kept in a dungeon of their family's basement for many, many years, and by their father, until they were rescued. Now, upon her rescue, she literally didn't know how people are to act, how people are to talk. And so she was trying to be what she thought people were supposed to be. She didn't change, but I changed. So the same behavior that 5 minutes earlier had caused such judgment in me, 5 minutes later, I felt such, not just compassion, admiration. So from within me, that's shift. The miracle, the shift in your own perception from lovelessness or fear to love. Now, the Course in Miracles would say that once I said that prayer, the Holy Spirit, who enters into this illusion of the three-dimensional reality with us to help us exit it in our consciousness, was once I requested it, and if I had not said that prayer, if I had not requested it, it would have been a violation of my free will to force that observation upon me. But once I requested it, the Holy Spirit, the Course says, was authorized, given full power in heaven and earth to give Marianne whatever Marianne needed to like open my eyes and see.
Do you usually experience it that quickly? Do you feel that as soon as you
I've been
send
in
that
some situations in my life, when I ran for office was certainly an example, where I was running too fast. You have to take responsibility for your lifestyle, take responsibility for the people around you, take responsibility. You know, it's like an alcoholic can't spend their whole day around whiskey. And a person who has an issue where, you know, if you have a sensitive nervous system, that which makes you most sensitive also makes you most unable to take it when situations are too frenetic.
Right.
And so I certainly have learned the high price I pay, sometimes others around me pay, if I don't make sure that that space is cultivated and protected.
The greatest shift that can take place is within. If we want to shift the world, if we want to shift what's going on around, we have to shift first.
Well, everything you do is infused with the consciousness with which you do it. But at the same time, your teaching is not held back by your own character defects. I mean, the world is not saying you have nothing to give until you are a perfect enlightened master.
Right.
We go forward and do what we can, knowing we will be confronted by our character defects, by our issues. But at the same time, God will work through even broken vessels to the extent to which we allow him to.
Right. Now, do you believe that we can insert this spiritual conversation into the realm of politics?
Well, I think that you and I already have in this conversation talking about ISIL, for example. Something I think is very spiritual is the conversation around the corruption of our democracy. You know, the founding of our country as a democracy did not just represent a huge step forward in the political history of the world. It was a huge step forward in the spiritual unfoldment of the world, because what democracy represents is the idea that, to the best of our ability, we will create a society in which people are able to fly at full wingspan. That's the American dream. That as long as I don't hurt anyone else, I can do whatever I want to do, say whatever I want to say, be whatever I want to be, and my voice is going to be as big as everybody else's in deciding where we go together. That's huge. That has to do with self-actualization. That has to do with evolution. That's something much bigger than just a political system. Now, what has happened in the last few years is that we have devolved. We have subconsciously recreated what is essentially an aristocratic system. Call it an oligarchy, a corporatocracy, whatever you call it. But it's reverting to a situation in which only a few people are entitled. Because if only a few people can afford to get educated, only a few people can afford healthcare, if only a few people can just afford to make it and have any disposable income whatsoever, then your basic resources of the society have been shifted into the hands of a very few. That's what has happened. That's why, for me, for instance, Bernie Sanders, who I support for president, the reason I feel so strongly about him is because I believe that conversation about income inequality, this is not just about money. This is about justice. This is about democracy. You know,
true American dream.
The true American dream. Not enough people can get into the club anymore. Not enough people can really have access to the things necessary to give you a fair chance of really making your dreams come true. So I think that there's more than a political passion there. There's a passion for the actualization of human beings, and that's why democracy is important, and that's why getting the money out of politics is, I believe, the greatest moral calling of our generation.
What about getting more women into politics?
Well, more women are getting in. We have a woman running for president right now who, if she wins the nomination fairly for the Democrats, I will certainly be voting for her. Obviously, we have, for the first time, a really, really major, she was a major candidate, obviously, in 2008. And more women are running. I know from experience, because I ran for Congress. It's rough in many ways, but I think less rough than it was a few years ago. Things are getting better. I think in issues like race and issues like women issues, gay people certainly. Listen, we haven't come all the way, but it's important to remember the strides we have made in all these areas. You know, a good friend, like a good therapist. If you're getting a little too high on yourself, they're there to remind you didn't do everything right. But if you're getting too down on yourself, they're there to remind you didn't do everything wrong. And I think that's true in talking about our country as well. We haven't done everything wrong, and we haven't done everything right. Guess what? We're human beings. So we're not blame American people if we talk about our need to take responsibility for our mistakes. Some people either just want to talk about what our country has done right without looking at the shadow.
Right.
Some people just want to talk about what we've done wrong without looking at the wonderful things we've done and do now. It's just like with a person. It's both and.
Did you have to be asked several times to run?
No, my calling to run for office was very definitely an internal calling. A Course in Miracles says, beware the temptation to self-initiated plans. It wasn't a self-initiated plan. It was a sense of calling. I have no doubt that I was called to it. Where I got off and made my mistake was that the same small voice for God that guided me to do it, I didn't allow that voice to guide every moment and every decision. I got involved in politics, not in terms of my issues or anything like that. I never compromised there, but in terms of running a campaign. I hadn't done
playing
it,
the game,
and I fell for the belief that you were supposed to do what those people tell you to do because they know.
Right, this way. Would you do it again?
If I ever felt the calling, which I don't, it's not there now. I'm very excited about the candidacy of Congressman Alan Grayson, who is running for the Senate in Florida. He's fantastic. I'm excited about Bernie Sanders. And I'm excited about the issues. I'm very excited about the issue of getting money out of politics. Lawrence Lessig, Wolfpack, the New Hampshire Rebellion. I do think we need a constitutional amendment that will establish public funding of all federal campaigns. That's the only way to get the money out of politics. I see the undue influence of money on politics as the cancer underlying all the other cancers. Running for office is one of the ways, and it's an important way, and it's a powerful way to harness a conversation. But it's not the only way,
right.
And you know that yourself. It's our citizenship that matters. It's using whatever our platforms are to bring forth the important conversation. Particularly as American women, I feel it is our responsibility to be a moral force on the planet. One of the things I admire about you is that while you were doing a magazine about higher consciousness, New Thought, spirituality, you were not steering away from these really adult conversations. And so I think that's another thing where we stick together and have each other's back and work together and sisterhood and all of that.
I always say a prayer right before I start to do my research. And I was drawn to that. I don't know, it was the first thing that I found. I was doing a whole bunch of research and I thought, this is such a powerful piece. And there was so much that you said in that one article.
Thank you.
And I'm going to have a link to that article
Thank you.
in the magazine for sure, because I think it's something to go back to. And like I said, I think there's a whole book there because you've covered...
Well, Healing the Soul of America is, it's a little dated in some of its facts because I wrote that in the late 90s. But the principles of applying spirituality to politics, that's that book.
Well, if it's anything like A Return to Love, which you wrote in 1992, I don't think we're going to have any problem with the relevancy of it.
Well, Clinton's no longer president,
right.
You know what I mean?
But it's just, you know, exactly.
The statistics are only more troubling now.
You've spoken also recently about spiritual malignancy and sort of, how we're kind of existing in this environment where it's all about me. And it was so funny because your humor cracks me up. I was laughing out loud. It's like, it's all about me, but I'm wondering why my relationships aren't working.
Yeah, that's a very good point.
Like,
that's exactly right. That until you shift from me to we.
Right, exactly. Me to we. And there was another thing that you had said was, to become a miracle worker means to take part in a spiritual underground that's revitalizing the world, participating in a revolution of the world's values at the deepest level possible. So it's like all of us, it doesn't have to necessarily be on the political stage, but it's like just do that deep work, do your own work, be a part of that underground.
Well, there's a very intimate relationship between personal transformation and global transformation. It's not either or, it's both
right.
And I don't talk about politics because I think it's the only important area. I think I'm not saying it's more important, but it's not less important. That's all I'm saying. And I think that, it's not the salvation of the world. The salvation of the world is the change of heart, the change of consciousness. But if we're not careful, that area can be the source of so much damage. I heard Deepak Chopra once say, if I want to cultivate health, I'm going Ayurvedic. But if I'm in a car accident, please take me to a Western medical hospital emergency room immediately.
Right.
So some things are long-term personal transformation issues, and some things we've got to act on.
Right. There's a time and place. Western medicine is crisis.
Right.
Then
exactly, and I think that that's the point here with politics. We are in a time of crisis. That's exactly the point. It's a time of crisis.
So would you say that there's a war on consciousness, or that many of us are sleepwalking, or perhaps both?
Well, I certainly don't think there's a war on consciousness. You and you alone are at choice what you are going to think. The only war on your consciousness is inside your own head. Mm-hmm. The ego is constantly making war on your consciousness. But those are internal chains that bind you, not external. Are we sleepwalking? First of all, even that question implies me like judging where other people are. And that's not, that. I don't think the discipline of spirituality leads you to do that. Among other things, let's remember that you don't need a majority of a system to change the world. The majority didn't wake up one day and go, let's free the slaves. The majority didn't wake up one day and say, oh, let's give women the right to vote.
Or I have an idea.
Yeah.
I have a dream.
That's not how social change occurs. Social change occurs because of a very small group of people who are usually considered outrageous radicals by the status quo of their time, who have a better idea, and history bends in their direction. It's that 100th monkey concept. It's the critical mass. Critical mass, what is it? Some people, we know it's nowhere near a majority, Some people say it's pi. That's less than 4%. So don't worry if the majority of people are sleepwalking. The majority of people are always sleepwalking. But societies change, civilizations change because of those who are not sleepwalking. So once again, don't worry about people who don't agree with you. Concern yourself with harnessing the power of the conversation and the social potential in the conversation of how many of us around the globe do agree that humanity needs to move in another direction now, and the only question is, what does that look like, and how do we do it, and how can each of us serve the process? Don't waste your time. We don't have time to indulge worrying about those who don't agree. Build deeper connectivity with those who do. That's the field that we're all co-creating today.
And so to that point, talking about the youth
Yes.
of our world.
Right.
And it's through the lens of our children
Right.
that we see what's possible. What direction would you like to see things?
I don't see what's possible through the lens of children. What I see through the lens of children, particularly as a mother, is how critically important it is that we bring forth what's possible. Children remind me of the urgency of the task. God reminds me of what's possible. Children remind me why it's so important to do that which is possible. We need to, obviously on a personal level, move from fear to love, from blame to blessing, from judgment to forgiveness, from focus on past or future to focus on present. To focus on us rather than just me. To do this work that makes us the purveyors of what the Course in Miracles calls an alternative. You become the presence of the alternative. You naturally attract others who are the same kind of higher frequency, what the Course in Miracles calls mighty companions. And you find yourself co-creating in synergistic relationship with other people doing better things. That's what we need to do personally. On a political and social level, we need to change the basic organizing principle of our society from economics to humanitarian values, from economics to brotherhood. Right now, our bottom line as a functioning society is short-term economic gain for basically multinational corporations represented and banks represented by very few citizens. We need to change that. We need to change that to real democratic principles, which includes a real concern for justice, economic justice, criminal justice, and brotherhood. We are not, this country should not function as a business. We're not a business. A business functions, and it should function in many cases, within an ethical context, on its economic bottom line. It needs to. That's not what a country is. Children, for instance, they do not represent an economic interest. They're too young, they don't work. So the way it works now, they don't make money, children, so they can't afford, huge corporate lobbyists running through the halls of Congress like the health insurance companies can, and the fossil fuel companies can, and the pharmaceutical companies can,
right.
and the private prison builders can, and the defense contractors can. So if you're only making it about money, which is what we have today, those lobbyists represent people who are saying to Congress people, do what we want you to do, or we're going to give money to those other candidates running against you, we're not going to give to you, and so forth. So that's what I mean, we're not a business, because we need Congress people and presidents who say, well, the children are the most important. My charge are the children and the citizens of this country and the health of the democracy itself. Once again, that's why getting the money out of politics is the most important issue of all.
And how do we get the money out of politics?
Well, there are a lot of organizations doing very good work. Wolfpack, Mayday, Lawrence Lessig at Harvard, the New Hampshire Rebellion. And, once again, Google it. Getting the money out of politics. There's a lot of good work being done now. I personally do support Lessig's idea about the constitutional amendment. Some people say, the constitutional amendment takes so long. Well, but that was what was needed to give women suffrage. That was what was needed to abolish slavery. And it does happen. And it can happen. And anything less than that is going to continue to drive the corruption of our democracy, which already has been so corrupted that it's a system of legalized bribery and corruption at this point.
So while I would like to stay here with you for the rest of my
we
life,
can talk about anything you want.
obviously, I would like to just ask you to, on the topic of our children and the topic of the future of our world, what prayer would you leave us with? What wish would you leave us with? And how do we return to love?
Well, the beauty of what's going on today is that the vast majority of people who are watching this right now, who are reading your magazine and so forth, are already attracted to that conversation, already know what they need to do. Pray more, meditate more, forgive more, be kinder, be more compassionate, be more responsible, have deeper ethics, greater integrity. The issue for most of us is not that we don't know what to do, it's that we don't do it enough.
Right.
When it comes to spirituality, a lot of us have paid our dues at the gym, we just don't go enough. So the era of data collection is over. The issue is not you don't know what Spirit is telling you to do. It's just you might not like what Spirit is telling you to do. There are many books. Mine is among thousands. Many teachings. Many of us know what the spiritual teaching is that calls to us, and we're doing it. Many of us know what spiritual teaching calls to us, but we know we should be doing it, and we're not. Others of us don't know, and if your prayer inside is show me how I can be a vessel of love, show me the teaching that would train my mind, books will fall at your feet. People
Literally.
will just happen to say things.
Yeah, or end up on your dining room table.
Exactly.
Change your life.
Go at that party.
Oh, Marianne, you are just absolutely a divine gift.
Thank you, so are you.
Really,
It takes one to know one.
Well, thank you. I'm humbled by that. But
Thank you.
literally, you are a gift to the world, beautiful inside and out.
Thank you.
Please keep rocking
Great.
and writing.
I will try my best, and you too, and the best of luck
speaking.
with your magazine
Thank
and all the
you.
work that you're doing around it.
Thank
You
you.
want to say a prayer?
Yeah,
Let's do it.
I'd love to say a prayer.
Dear God, we surrender to you all that we have and all that we are. Use us for purposes of love. Make us the people that you would have us be, that we might do what you would have us do. That we might be vessels for the love that casts out all fear, for the peace that casts out all conflict. May this world be blessed. May all living things be blessed. And so it is. We all say, amen.
Amen. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
God bless you.